Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome at the Live Nardis and Limosa webinar on earthworms. We're very pleased to have you here. And we also are very pleased to have our speakers of the day, which are two, where Jeff Hendricks from Natuurpunt will explain about the Live Nardis and Limosa project, and where Jeroen Onrust from the province of Groningen will inform us about the study and the research he has done on earthworms, key players for farmland biodiversity. For those that are not familiar with Eurocide, I would like to give a very short introduction about what Eurocide is. So Eurocide, the European Land Conservation Network, is a gathering of people working on land conservation, site managers all over Europe, landowners, farmers. And so Eurocide is a network, a knowledge network of people addicted to land conservation and working in 25 European countries at the moment. Sometimes we say Eurocide represents 14 million hectares when you look at the membership of Eurocide, with the largest site management organizations in different countries. So for example, I know a lot of people from the Netherlands and Belgium are here today. So Natuurmonumenten, Staatsbosbeheer, in Belgium it is Natuurpunt. These are the typical members of Eurocide. And so 12,000 site practitioners are represented by Eurocide. So our main mission is to connect competence in conservation, and that's also what we do today. And we do that through our international thematic working groups on these topics. So if you're interested in one of these topics and interested to join Eurocide, you're more than welcome, and just let us know. Well, I will now hand over to, oh, I see that Jeroen is still sharing his, no, he's not. Sorry, I'm not that technical, so I have to find out. I will now hand over to Jeff Hendricks from Natuurpunt. Please, Chef, if you could turn on your camera and share your screen and tell your story. We can't see you yet.
Here we go.
Yeah, now we can.
Yeah, and you can see my screen?
Yeah, we can. Thank you.
Okay, so hello everyone. So this webinar is part of the Live Nardis and Limosa project. And before we go to the part you all came for, I will very shortly explain what this project is about. So what's Nardis and what's Limosa? Nardis is about Nardis grasslands, so this kind of flower-rich grasslands. And Limosa, on the other hand, is about meadow birds, for instance, godwits, curlews, lapwings. So the project is about Nardis grasslands and meadow birds and how they go together. The Nardis part is very easy. It's about restoration of Nardis grasslands, starting from agricultural grasslands with high soil nutrient concentrations. So we remove soil nutrients to restore this flower-rich grasslands. But the interesting part is the fact that there's meadow birds breeding in these grasslands. And both goals, the meadow birds and the grassland restoration, don't seem to go very well together. So because in conventional meadow bird management, we try to keep soil organic matter high to provide food for the meadow birds, sometimes even with application of manure. And conventional grassland restoration, on the other hand, is nutrient removal. But that means less organic matter and less food for the birds. So there is kind of a management dilemma. Do we choose Nardis or do we choose Limosa? Well, in this project, we choose Nardis and Limosa, obviously. And we are developing ways to combine both goals. And that's where earthworms are an important factor. Because the earthworms are food for the meadow birds, and they are related to the soil organic matter, and that's why we invited Jeroen today. It's good to know that research is an important part of the project. There is the University of Ghent researching and monitoring the abiotic situation during the grassland restoration. And there is the Bargerveen Foundation researching the food availability for the birds. And of course, there's Eurosite for sharing the knowledge like we're doing right now. I'll quickly show you the, oh yeah, here they are, the project areas. So there are 5 project areas in which we're doing this grassland restoration. They're all in the Campine region in Belgium and the Netherlands. Well, that was a very brief overview of the project, but you can find a lot more information in our project webpage, and you can contact me with this email address with any question. So enjoy the Earthworm webinar.
Thank you very much, Chef, and for your clear introduction. And yeah, very happy to introduce Jeroen. Welcome. I'm glad that you're here. Maybe just to start is that in my previous job, when I was working for BirdLife in the Netherlands, I already learned a lot about your research, and I was intrigued by the fact that in the middle of the night, you were crawling around searching for earthworms. So I'm really interested in hearing your story. Welcome. You are a biologist. You studied, you did your research and your PhD on the interaction between soil fauna, earthworms, and meadowbirds. And currently, you're working for the University of Groningen in the Godwit Landscape Project. So welcome here.
Yes. Thank you.
Before you start, for the audience, please, if you have questions, use the Q&A, preferably not the chat, but preferably the Q&A. So after his talk, Jeroen will answer the questions. We cannot guarantee that he is able to answer all the questions, but we'll try as much as possible. So Jeroen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Harm. And thank you all for being here. So can you see my screen? Yes, so today I would like to take you with me through my research, which is mostly about earthworms. And I hope that I can convince you that red earthworms specifically are very important in this ecosystem. I first want to show you these nice pictures, because my background is actually in bird ecology. So I'm a bird researcher. So I look to food and earthworms from a bird perspective, and especially in meadowbirds, earthworms are very important. So that's why I ended up with my research, which is mainly about earthworms. And I also want to introduce the study system I'm working in, and therefore I have to zoom out a bit more. Here you see a very nice picture of the Netherlands from space. And the nice thing that you can see is that the Netherlands is a true delta, and it's formed by rivers and by the sea. And that created relatively high water tables, and also moist and soft sediments. And these are the perfect circumstances for dairy farming. And dairy farming is quite well known in the Netherlands, and it's also already for centuries one of the most important farming practices here. And these farming systems, that also created a whole bird culture, which we name meadowbirds, and especially the black-tailed godwit, which you see standing here on a pole. It's our Dutch national bird, because about 80% of this species breeds in the Netherlands. So, and they breed in mostly in agricultural grasslands, which are used for dairy farming. So this is also the system I'm working in. And as you probably all know, most species from farmland are in decline, and that's also the case for the black-tailed godwit. Here you see the trend from 1989, the year when I was born, until now, the trend of the black-tailed godwit. And here you see another species, also quite dramatic decline. And it's not a bird, but it's the dairy farmer. And it's surprising to see that both the dairy farmers and the black-tailed godwits declined in the same amount in this period. However, it's not such a big surprise because they are actually both victim of the very large-scale intensification of agriculture. So what we want to do in our research is to look at how can we change this trend, not only for the black-tailed godwits, but also for the dairy farmers, to create more sustainable dairy farmers where they both can profit from. And therefore we started the Godwit Landscapes project a few years ago. And in this project, we try to understand how we can create a more sustainable dairy farming. And the Godwit is our indicator for that. So where there are Godwits, then the farming is also going well, actually. And our approach is to look at the whole food web of this system. So we have a whole team of people working on that. I work mostly on the earthworms and the soil fauna. But there are people also working on the vegetation, on the insects, on the predators, on the farmers also are included. And it's all around this, our flagship species, the black-tailed godwit. So this is also our study area in Southwest Friesland, in the northern part of the Netherlands. It's quite a large area. We started in 2004 in this blue part. In 2007, the green and yellow part were added, and then in 2012, the red part was added. And in this area, we follow the black-tailed godwit population, so the whole demography from breeding till fledgling, etc. So we know exactly the survival of all these birds breeding there. And there are about 800 breeding pairs in this whole area. But I won't tell you much about the black-tailed godwits. I will focus mostly on the earthworms, of course. And this is a very nice picture of herb-rich meadows, which also Jeff also pointed out earlier. But these type of grasslands are quite scarce nowadays because most of them are turned into this ryegrass monocultures, because they simply produce much more milk than these herb-rich meadows. So this created a whole new ecosystem, actually, because if you look to the food web of these grasslands, then if you have a herb-rich meadow, then at the base of that food web, you have different plant species, different primary producers that produce litter, leaves, seeds, and nectar, which are fed by the primary consumers, which are also eaten by the secondary consumers, etc. But if you have only a few grass species left, then it's quite obvious that you also lose a whole part of that food web. So it's not so surprising that most of the species of farmland are declining nowadays. But there's one group of organisms that seem to do very well in the Netherlands, and those are earthworms. If you go into a grassland here in the Netherlands and you take a soil sample, you will easily find a handful of earthworms. And that puzzled me when I started my research, because how come that there are so many earthworms and all the birds and all the organisms that feed on these worms are doing poorly? yeah, it's also illustrated by this map. It's based on a model, but it's quite accurate, I think, because you see that the Netherlands is actually the earthworm hotspot in Europe. And it's mainly because of these grasslands we have here. That's a perfect habitat for earthworms. You see also on the map of the Netherlands on the right, especially these low-lying parts where we have a lot of grasslands. There you can find the highest densities of earthworms. And it's not uncommon to find more than 1,000 worms per square meter here. So that's a huge amount of food also, you would say. But why is it then that there are so many worms, but are the worm-eating birds doing so poorly? Well, therefore I started to jump into the world of earthworms to understand this. And one of the first books I read was the last book of Charles Darwin, The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms, with observations on their habits. And I can recommend everyone to read it. It's very nice to read all these observations he did, and also how he looked at earthworms, because it also changed the way we look at earthworms nowadays, and we now see them as a very important species, and we name them also ecosystem engineers, because they break down organic material, they make nutrients available, they mix the soil particles by crawling through the soil. They also are important for the soil structure and for infiltration of water, because of all these burrows they create. They disperse seeds and soil organisms through these burrows. And the part I'm working mostly on is as the food source for other organisms. So back to the birds, I started my research mostly doing work on lapwings and other plover birds, on also the ruff, not so much on the godwit. And it started with this because we thought that the abundance of earthworms is not so much important. It's more about the availability of earthworms. And for example, if a lapwing, they look between the grass leaves to find food. So it's not about the density of earthworms in the soil, but it's about the amount of worms that also are between the grass leaves. And therefore, we had to come up with a new method to measure this earthworm availability. And therefore, I came up with this card method. And it's actually a very simple method. I lay on this with my belly on this card, and with my legs behind it, I push myself forwards. And in that way, I'm very close to the soil surface, so I can look very good between the grass leaves to find earthworms. And I can drive very slowly through these grasslands without creating too much disturbance, so that the worms won't retract into the burrows. And it actually works very nicely. And in this way, we were able to measure earthworm availability for these lapwings very well. This is actually what you can see in such a grassland. You see earthworms between the grasses, mostly with the tail anchored in the burrow, and with the head, they're searching for all kinds of organic material, mostly dead leaves, and they pull it into the burrow then. Very interesting to see. And also here are some more pictures. They also come to the surface to mate, also very interesting to observe. But they are strictly nocturnal active. Here I measured from 4 p.m. in the afternoon until 8 a.m. in the morning, every hour, the same transect. And then you see when it's still light, then you don't find any earthworms. But as soon as the sun sets, then the numbers of worms increase. And before the sun rises again, then they are gone again. So they're strictly nocturnal active. So I did my work also mostly at night, spending a lot of hours in these fields counting and observing earthworms under all kinds of circumstances. So also in the winter, also in the summer, at different fields, and very intensive fields and very extensive fields, all to understand what determines this earthworm availability. But at night, there are also a lot of earthworm eating animals active. For example, here you see a movie that I made of a golden plover. Golden plovers winter here in the Netherlands, and they also eat a lot of earthworms. And here you see it catching a very large earthworm. And you also see the very big eyes they have to look at night. And another bird species that also eat a lot of worms at night are little owls, for example. They also consume a lot of earthworms. But also mammals like badgers and hedgehogs and foxes, they also eat a lot of earthworms, and they also mainly do it at night, because then the earthworms come to the surface and then they are available for them. However, I always said about the earthworm, but the earthworm doesn't exist. There are multiple species of earthworms. In the Netherlands, we have about 25 different species of earthworms. And in a grassland, you can find about 8 or 9 species. And here you see a selection of that. And you immediately see already the huge variation between these worms, in size, of course, but also in color. And because they can coexist, they also should do a bit different things in these grasslands. Otherwise, they simply can't coexist, of course. And therefore, what we always do as a biologist, we place them in eco groups or ecotypes. And one of the most famous one is this one, where we talk about the epigeics, which are the worms that live in the litter layer. So they live in the top layer, actually. You have the anesic worms that also eat litter, but they can also go down very deep into the soil, sometimes even up to 2 meters deep. And you have the endogeics, and endogeics, they mostly eat soil particles, and they live a bit deeper into the soil. But for my research, I was mostly interested in whether they come to the surface, yes or no. So I divided this again in 2 groups, and based on a feeding behavior. So I mainly talk about the red worms and the gray worms. And the red worms, those are the worms that come to the surface to collect food, all kinds of dead organic material. And the gray worms, they don't come to the surface because they have a different diet, actually. So they mainly feed on soil particles and organic matter, what is already further decomposed. And in my papers, I talk about detritophorous earthworms, which are the red worms, and geophagous earthworms, which are the gray worms. But in this presentation, I will mainly talk about red and gray worms. So here you see 2 typical red and gray worms. The red worm, they are mostly also reddish colored, and that's because they have a lot of pigmentation in their skin. And they need, of course, some pigmentation as protection against the sun, because they are often also in the top layer of the soil. Gray worms are gray worms because they don't have pigments in their skin, and therefore you can look quite easily through their skin. And when they are full with soil, then they look a bit grayish. However, there are also gray worms which are green or even pink. So it's not always very easy to see, but then you have to look at the head, actually. And when the head is really dark pigmented, you know you have a red earthworm. And I will show this slide multiple times during this presentation to highlight the differences between these 2 groups. So it's first of all, it's about the pigmentation, and the diet is the difference. So these red worms, they eat mainly this fresh organic material. Grey worms eat organic material which is further decomposed. So here you see a red earthworm collecting a dead grass leaves. And it's fascinating to see how they do it, because they don't have any teeth or so. So they just grab a leaf with their mouth, and then they pull the muscles, they try to pull it into the burrows. And it's an enormous amount of work these red worms do, because all the leaves that fall on the soil, they are pulled into the burrows by these red worms. And you can also see it during the day, especially in this time of the year. If you go outside and you see leaves or twigs standing straight up in the soil, you know that a red worm was busy there, trying to pull it into the burrow to consume it further there. And Charles Darwin also made very nice observations on how these worms do this. And based on these observations, he said that earthworms are also intelligent organisms, because it's very clever how they do that. Back to the grasslands. If you go into the field and you take a soil sample and you count the number of red and grey worms, what you normally find on average is about this distribution. So about a quarter of the worms are red worms and the rest are grey worms. And that's almost always the case, especially in these agricultural grasslands. Red worms are always in a minority, and it's mostly grey worms that you can find. However, if you look at the surface, what I did with my card method, then you see that it are mainly these red worms. So on the left, you see the distribution in the soil. On the right, the distribution when they are crawling around at night. So sometimes you find grey worms, but it's mostly the red worms that come to the surface at night. So also in these ecosystem surfaces, they are slightly different, these red and grey worms. I won't go into detail, but you see that red worms, they play an important role in the decomposition of organic material. And grey worms, they are important also for the soil structure and for creating soil aggregates. So the meadow birds. So here you see a very nice picture of birds eating worms. And on the left, you see an oystercatcher and a godwit, and they both have very long bill. And with the bill, they probe into the soil. And when they find an earthworm, they pull it out and they eat it. So they are tactile feeders. On the right, you see a lapwing and a golden plover. And as I said, they have very big eyes and a relatively short bill. So they find mainly their prey by using visual cues. And this is an important difference how they find their prey, because it also determines the earthworm availability for them. That's what I show here. So a godwit, they can eat actually all the worms which are in reach of their bill length. So they can catch a grey worm or a red worm. But for a lapwing, they can only eat the red worms that come to the surface. So the availability for a lapwing is much lower than for a godwit. Therefore, when conditions change, then lapwings are more vulnerable for these changing conditions than godwits. So we thought that godwits would eat grey worms and red worms, but that's not completely true, because my PhD student, René Veenstra, she spent the last few years observing a lot of feeding godwits. And what she also did was to collect droppings of godwits. So she observed them, and when she saw that the godwit was pooping, then she went into the field and collected that fresh dropping. She put it into a tube, and in the lab we could analyze which species of earthworms these birds were eating. And then we saw, so these are preliminary results, that most of the godwits also eat red earthworms. So here you see different samples, so different droppings of a godwit. And you see that the majority of these these birds eat red earthworms. So in the soil, as I said, we found about 24% red earthworms. But if you look in the diet of godwits, then surprisingly they find they consume much more red worms than you would expect based on what's available. So probably these black-tailed godwits, they can make a discrimination between a red worm and a gray worm in the soil without seeing them. So probably they taste different or they behave differently in the soil, these earthworms. Because it's not so that gray worms are much deeper into the soil, they're also in the top layer of this grasslands. But that's still something we have to find out. But it shows again that red worms are also important for black-tailed godwits. I will now tell you a bit more about what determines or what's actually important for earthworms. And one of the most important thing, or actually the most important thing, is of course water, because earthworms are actually water organisms. They don't have lungs, but they breathe through their skin, and therefore they need moist conditions. And when a soil is drying out, then what the worms do is they form a kind of knot, a ball, with some mucus around them. And in this way, they go into kind of diapause, and they wait until the conditions becomes better again. But this is only true for gray worms. The two worms you see here are gray worms. So they look very reddish, but they are gray worms, because gray worms are the only worms that can do this. Red worms, they can't do this behavior. And what they do, they go deeper into the soil to moist layers. Or what happens more often is also that they die during very severe drought events. So these gray worms are more able to cope with drought. So that's also a big difference between red and gray worms. So the red worms are more drought sensitive than these gray worms. Another thing what is important, if when it's too cold, then red earthworms also don't come to the surface anymore. So during cold events, lapwings have a problem. But if a godwit is still able to probe in the soil, as you can see here in these pictures, they don't have a problem, because then they can still find enough food to feed on. So for the visual hunters, it's a problem. For tactile hunters, it's not directly a problem if it's too cold. However, it shouldn't be too cold. If the soil is frozen, then they simply can't probe in the soil anymore. And that's also happening in the summer, of course, because then also the soil is starting to dry out. And that's especially a problem for the chicks of godwits, because it's also this period when they switch from eating insects to eating earthworms, and their bill's not well developed yet. And if the soil is too hard, then they really have problems to find enough food. And that's a crucial period for these chicks. And we're now planning with a new project as a follow-up on this godwit landscapes project to look in more detail about in this period of this black-tailed godwits chicks. Because if they simply can't probe in the soil, then they also have a problem. So moist conditions are crucial. When the soil desiccates, the redworms won't come to the surface anymore, which is bad for the visual hunter. But eventually the soil also becomes impenetrable, which is also bad for a tactile hunter. So earthworm availability is mainly determined by the water conditions. Another important thing is manure. Although for worms it's not the most important thing, but in the Netherlands we have so much manure that it is of course something that plays a role. And here you see two farmers fertilizing their land early in spring. On the left you see a farmer that is spreading farmyard manure at the surface. And farmyard manure is very solid manure. It's bedding material mixed with the feces of a cow. It's composted for a while and then it's spread on the surface. That's actually how it was done in the early times. But nowadays it's mostly what the farmer on the right is doing. He is injecting slurry manure, and slurry manure is this very liquid type of manure. It contains no bedding material, and it has to be injected into the soil because of legislation. Here you see how it looks like. It's a completely different type of manure if you see it like this. And that's also what I was puzzling about. Does it also affect the earthworms? Because if farmyard manure is spread out in early spring, then a few weeks later you see all these straws from the farmyard manure standing straight up into the soil because of all these redworms are collecting it and trying to pull it into the burrows. But what I wanted to know is, how do these worms actually grow on different types of earthworms? So I collected the cocoons of earthworms. From a cocoon, one or sometimes two earthworms hatch, and I put such a young earthworm into a pot, and I gave them or farmyard manure, or slurry manure, or hay, and I did it for grey and redworms. And every month I took them out of this pot and I weighed the worm to look how it was developing. And here you see the results of that. And what you see is that the redworms, they grow fastest and also became much larger on farmyard manure than on these other types of manure. And if you look to grey worms, then we didn't find any difference. Especially in the beginning, it doesn't matter if they receive farmyard manure or slurry manure, it was all the same. Eventually you see that both worms, the growing rate was declining when they were on slurry manure. But what this shows you is that for redworms, farmyard manure is important to grow on, and for grey worms it doesn't really matter actually the type of manure. That's also what you see in the field. If you take a soil sample in all kinds of fields and which are only fertilized with slurry manure, you see that you find mainly grey worms and rarely redworms. But if you use more farmyard manure, then you also see the number of redworms increasing, whereas the number of grey worms remains more or less stable. So for redworms, farmyard manure is really important. And it probably has all to do, not so much with the nitrogen component in it, but the carbon component in it. So it contains a lot of organic material which is not decomposed so much, the straw material. And what you then have is that there's a lot of fungi growing on that. And fungi are an important food source for redworms. So it promotes also very good conditions for redworms. Whereas if you have slurry manure is very rich in nitrogen. That promotes bacteria, and that's good for grey worms. So it's mainly also about these microbes growing on this type of manure. So again, this difference. So redworms, they seem to do better in fungi dominant systems, so very old grasslands and with low nitrogen inputs. Grey worms seem to do very well in these very high productive systems where bacteria are dominant. However, slurry manure, as I said, has to be injected into the soil, and that's also causing quite some mortality among earthworms, and especially red earthworms seem to be have a problem with this, not only because they live in the top layer of the soil, but also when a worm is cut into 2 pieces, you won't end up with 2 worms, but you will end up with a dead worm actually. Especially red worms, they won't survive that. And grey worms, they still can survive that. If a part of the tail is missing, then they can grow a new tail, but that's not the case for red worms. So therefore, after such an event, and also after plowing and reseeding of grasslands, then you see that it takes multiple years for a red worm population to come back again. And it probably all has to do also with the regenerative capacity they don't have. So what I show you now is that all these nowadays farming practices, they are not so good for red worms, and that's also seen in other countries. Here it was in the UK, there was a citizen science project where they also alarmed about the disappearance of these red worms. We also did, I organized a citizen science project or a worm survey in 2022, where people could join this research by looking for which type of eco groups they have in their garden or in farmland. It was a big success. There were a lot of people joining throughout the whole Netherlands. People were taking part in this project. However, most participants found it quite difficult to distinguish these different types of earthworms. It was not so easy to look at the differences between these groups, unfortunately. But going back to farmland again, so you have these 2 systems, very rich system and a very biodiverse, poor system actually. This is a problem if you don't have red worms anymore in the soil. And I want to show you with an experiment I did in the Oostvaardersplassen. And maybe you know this area. It's a quite famous natural area in the Netherlands. It's a large rewilding area. And what you have here is it's a closed system, so it's a large grasslands. There are grazers walking in. There's no input from outside, and there are a lot of red worms living there. So what I did, I took soil samples from this area, very intact soil samples, and not only from this area, but also from a conventional farmer close to that, and a biodynamic farmer. And I brought these sods of grass to the greenhouse in Groningen. And a part of these sods received red worms, a part received only manure, a part received red worms and manure, and a part received nothing as a control. And what we did, we let it grow for a few months, and every month we clipped it and we looked at the production of these sods, so the grass production. So it was growing very well in this greenhouse. And here you see the results of that. And what you see is actually that there's hardly any difference between these treatments and between these grasslands. However, only in the treatment where we added these redworms and manure, then the production goes up very steeply, especially in this natural grassland, so the Oostvaardersplassen, a little bit less in the biodynamic grasslands, but we didn't find any worm effect in this conventional grasslands. And it has probably all to do with that these grasslands, they are not, these conventional grasslands, they are not relying on this on soil organisms and earthworms, because they simply are not there anymore, and it takes a while for all these soil organisms to work together to create a very productive grassland. So even in natural grasslands, without any input from outside, you can get a very high production if and it's probably these redworms playing an important role in it, because they enhance this whole cycle. So here you see again this on the left, you have this robust system with a lot of different species, with the redworms also playing an important role in that, not only below ground but also above ground. And on the right you also have a very productive system, but it's relying on the input from outside actually, so adding manure or fertilizer to keep this process going. And what we hope in this project is that we can combine actually these two worlds actually, so that we the farmer make more use of this natural power actually, not only from earthworms but also from other organisms living in that, so we can create eventually a more sustainable type of dairy farming, where not only the birds and the worms are flourishing, but also the farmer. So with this nice picture of a very beautiful red earthworm, I would quickly highlight the take-home messages. So redworms, they play a key role in the above and below ground food web. But in conventional farming systems, mostly grey worms are found. So when we go back to the slide I show you with the density of earthworms in the Netherlands, so there are very high density of earthworms here, but it are mostly grey worms. And as I showed you, that it's not about abundance, what is important for most birds and other organisms, but it's about availability. And abundance is not equal to availability. And redworms, to get them back in your system and to work them for you, you have to create less soil disturbance. You have to fertilize only with organic carbon-rich litter, or no fertilization at all. That's also good. And moist soil conditions are important to keep this worm active and also available for other prey items, organisms. And with this nice picture, I would like to thank you for listening. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jeroen. And thank you very much for a very clear and quiet and calm explanation of your research. It was easy to follow. So thank you very much.
Great.
Well, for the audience, please, oh yeah, maybe you could stop sharing. Thank you. And Chef, maybe you could put up your mic, your camera as well, because there might also be questions for you. I don't know. But audience, if you have questions, we have a few minutes left to discuss a few questions. And I see there's one in the chat. Well, that's something I could answer. Yeah, there will be a recording of the webinar available. So please check the Eurosite website and maybe the Live Natus and Limosa website that Chef showed you, which you can find at Natuurpunt. Maybe you can add it in the chat, Chef, the link. So later we will put the recording there. But apparently we have quite a bit of a shy audience, so I would really like to try to convince you to ask a few questions to. We see a few hands. Yeah. But we have a question from Claude Cottin. Thank you very much. Jeroen, is there a possibility of introducing species of red earthworms if the soil doesn't have them anymore?
That's an interesting question. I also, a lot of farmers also ask me that. But it's actually not necessary, because the first thing you have to do is to create the circumstances right for these redworms. As I said in the last slide, if you have less soil disturbance and you fertilize your land with the right manure, actually, then eventually the redworms will come back to the field, actually. So there are always redworms around in the surroundings, also in maybe from ditches, etc., or from, you can bring them in from with maybe the compost or anything else. And redworms, they have an advantage that the reproduction rate is very high. So if the conditions are right, within a few years' time, the population can increase quite rapidly. So I would recommend first to create the good conditions for worms instead of the other way around, by introducing the worms and then wait for them to come back. So yeah, and I know, especially the big earthworms and Nisics, they are difficult to get back again, but yeah, eventually they will come back. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Jeroen, and thank you from Claude. So that's good. Teja Silic, I presume from Croatia. She asked, do you have any idea why the probing birds prefer the red worms over the gray ones?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because we are also still puzzling about that. And so Renee, the PhD student working on that, she did some experiments also to look at if the red worms maybe taste differently than gray worms. But we still haven't figured out that very well. We simply don't know, actually. And it could be that red worms, they are slightly bigger than gray worms, so they are maybe more profitable to eat. But still, yeah, it's not a huge difference. So it's interesting how they can make this discrimination between gray and red worms. So it's still something we're working on. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your answer. Here, the Eurosat colleagues are laughing about how would you do such a kind of research, trying to find out the taste of an earthworm. But
Yeah.
that's for another day. Thank you. Next question is from Jeroen Arnois. Is there a way to restore the red earthworm population after topsoil removal?
Yeah, it's actually the same answer I also previously gave. If you don't disturb the soil too much anymore, and you have a very good sward, eventually the worms will come back, and it takes maybe 10 years or so, or longer, but eventually these worms will come back also. Yeah, and because there are also very nice experiments here in the Netherlands, because we have also reclaimed polders here in the Netherlands, where there were also no earthworms. For example, the Oostvaardersplassen, there were no earthworms when it was created 40 years ago or something. Mm-hmm. But they just came in also by birds that bring them via the legs, or maybe by feeding their chicks or so. So also in that way, they can colonize these new areas. And also when you remove the top layer, I think, yeah, it can go quite quickly to get these worms back.
Okay. Thank you again, Jeroen. And thank you, audience, for a lot of questions now. I don't think we have the time to answer them all because we really want to end at 4, but we try a few. So Jeroen from Rodrigo Pizarro from Spain. In the Murcia province, there's a lot of eutrophication. With an adequate concentration of earthworms, could the massive use of fertilizer be eliminated? It's thinking the other way around, I think.
Yeah, no, that's actually a very good question, because that's also the problem here in the Netherlands, that most grasslands are too rich in nutrients, and it can promote a number of earthworms, especially these grey worms, but what you want is actually a nutrient poor system. And also in a nutrient poor system, still earthworms can survive, especially red earthworms, but in much lower densities, of course. And it's the question if what the density of earthworms you actually need for example, meadowbirds or other species. And we simply don't know, probably because in the past, lapwings and godwits, they were also breeding in very nutrient poor systems where there are hardly any earthworms, but we're doing very well. So probably they can also find another prey, or they don't need such a high number of earthworms actually. So I always would recommend to reduce the amount of nutrients in a system, because eventually you will go to a more fungi dominant system, which is more robust for the soil, but also for the whole ecosystem actually. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'm really sorry, because now we have a lot of questions and we have no time anymore. So that's really pity. Maybe my last question is for myself, because I'm curious if how the farmer community is interested in if you have seen a change in the last decade in your research, in your work, and interested to take measures on their field in the direction of more population of red earthworms. Is that, how do you see that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting, because when I started my research, I went to a farmer with my cart and asked them, well, can I count earthworms here at night? And then they look at you and think, well, okay, you're crazy, but go ahead. But soon, when they realized also the importance of earthworms, and that's also changed the last few years, then they realized that it's important to look at earthworms, and also they started to ask me if they have enough red worms and if they have more worms than their neighbor, for example. So it's changing quite quickly, and also because farmers also see that when it's very dry, they simply don't have enough grass to feed on the cows or etc. So they also have to think well, differently towards this system, and I think that this approach, this food web approach, can help also these farmers to have a more sustainable farming. And yeah, especially with all the discussion nowadays, there's still well, there are a lot of farmers thinking about worms, which is very good, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jeroen. We're approaching the end now of the webinar, and I would like to ask Sophia to put on her camera, if I may, because she wants to say something on behalf of Eurosite.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody, and yeah, thanks, Jeroen and Jeff, for the inspiring presentations, and staying on topic, but shifting it a bit. I would like to yeah, shift your attention to an upcoming Red Grassland Day organized by Eurosite together with the Latvian Fund for Nature, with the title Best Practices in Management of Wet Grasslands. And as you can see, we will have presentations from various European countries with different topics ranging from restoration approaches, mobile grazing herds, also a grazing study tour that Eurosite organized last year, Yeah, one of them was through to the Oostvaardersplassen. Also, it will include different bird species and how to include them in wet grassland management. It will be on the 16th of January, and it will be a full day event, so starting at 10, going until 12, where we have a small lunch break, and then starting again at 1 o'clock. And it will be via Zoom. I have 2 links for you. One is Eurosite's website, where you can have more information, and you can also register there, or you can just click on the link in the chat and register directly as well. So if it's something you're interested in, then we're looking forward to having you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Well, my final words are that the recording will be available on the link that was shared by Chef with us, and there are some outstanding questions. So together with Chef and Jeroen, we will look into them to see if we can still answer a few and let you know directly in a direct response. Thank you very much for listening in, and thank you mostly Jeroen and Chef for your very interesting story. I think it was very interesting for us all, and looking forward to see you all again. Thank you.